Hello, I'm Steve Young, and welcome to Airbag Steering Columns Volume 2. This tape is intended as a supplement to Airbags Volume 1, which was introduced in April of 1989. Since that time, several new airbag-equipped steering columns have been introduced by General Motors and Chrysler. This tape will cover those new steering columns as well as some changes General Motors has made to the V.A.T.S system. The steering columns that you will see include 3 new GM steering columns and 1 new Chrysler steering column. The most widely used GM column is found on the Corvette and Camaro, as well as a wide range of other GM models. The second column is a tilt wheel column, which is being used on the W-bodied cars and on some of the Berettas and the Corsicas. The third column is a non-tilt steering column, which is found only on certain Beretta and Corsica models. This is the first time that General Motors has provided an airbag on a non-tilt steering column. You will also see the new Chrysler ACCUSTAR steering column, which has replaced the Saginaw-style column shown in Airbags Volume 1. As of 1990, all GM vehicles that are equipped with V.A.T.S, which is also known as passkey, have airbags as standard equipment. Many of these vehicles use a new 48-pin connector. This connector provides a common plug for all of the wires from the steering column, including the V.A.T.S wire. This 48-pin connector is not compatible with most interrogators without an adapter of some sort. The use of 2 different types of adapters will be shown in this tape. The most important change to the airbag system since 1989 is the introduction of a reserve power supply, which is commonly referred to as an RPS unit. The sole purpose of this device is to provide power to the airbag in the event that the battery should be disconnected or destroyed in the early stages of a collision. It is now extremely important that you wait at least 10 minutes on most vehicles after the battery has been disconnected before you begin removing the airbag module. The quick reference guide packed with your tape contains important information on RPS units as well as other cautions regarding airbags. Please read this information carefully for your own protection. Before we begin working on the steering columns, let's take a look at some of the tools we'll be using. This is a wheel puller, which is used to remove the steering wheel from the steering shaft. Many different styles of pullers are available with different bolts for a variety of different applications. This is a V.A.T.S interrogator, which is manufactured by Kentmore Tools. This tool is one of many that can be used to determine the correct resistor value for a V.A.T.S equipped vehicle. For more information on the V.A.T.S system, refer to V.A.T.S Made Simple, TechTrain's video number 558, which covers 3 different methods for interrogating a V.A.T.S system. This is the Kentmore 48-pin adapter. This unit is designed to be inserted between the 2 halves of the 48-pin connector. Once installed, the adapter provides a standard V.A.T.S connector for the attachment of the interrogator. This adapter has been included as a standard accessory with the interrogator since mid-1989. This is the TechTrain 4002 V.A.T.S bypass adapter. This unit slips over the head of the tryout key and connects to any interrogator to provide a direct electrical connection from the interrogator to the V.A.T.S module through the ignition lock itself. This unit can be used with any method of interrogation, including the lock and 15 key method. That completes the tool section. Now let's take a look at the most common GM airbag column. As a general rule, you will be working on an airbag steering column only under one of 2 circumstances. Either you will have a working key or you will not have a working key. If you have a working key, there are several things you should do to protect yourself before you begin the job. First, turn the key to the on position and observe the airbag warning light. It should flash a number of times and then go off on the new airbag steering columns. If it continues to flash, or if it comes on and stays on, or if it does not come on at all, this indicates that there is a problem with the airbag system. Do not work on the car. Refer the owner to the dealership. If the light flashes and then goes off, take note of the number of times that the light flashes and then compare that number to the number of times it flashes when the job is completed. Secondly, start the car and turn the front wheels so that they are straight, if they're not straight already. If you do not have a working key, then you will have to satisfy yourself that the airbag system was working correctly before the key was lost. The easiest and perhaps least reliable way to do this would be to question the owner of the car about the operation of the airbag warning light. If this is not satisfactory, then there are other methods that you could use, including picking the lock, making a key by impression, try-out keys, or as a last resort, drilling the lock out and turning it to the on position. However you decide to do this, be aware that you are accepting a liability and that you do not have to do the job. If you do not feel comfortable doing it, then refer the owner of the car to the dealership. For more information on alternative methods of checking the airbag system, refer to the quick reference guide which was packed with your tape. Now let's see how to disassemble the most common of the new GM airbag steering columns. This is a 1991 Cadillac Sedan DeVille. The same steering column is found in a wide variety of other General Motors cars, including the Camaro, Corvette, Buick Park Avenue, and Oldsmobile Touring Sedan. This steering column incorporates the 48-pin connector. As with any airbag steering column, the first step is to disconnect the battery. Once you have disconnected the negative terminal, isolate that terminal by placing duct tape either around the end of the cable or over the terminal of the battery. This is done to prevent the terminal and cable from accidentally making contact after they have been disconnected. As an added safeguard, you may want to disconnect the positive terminal of the battery, although this is not absolutely necessary. The next step is to locate and remove the airbag fuse or fuses, but only after our waiting period has elapsed, at least 10 minutes for any General Motors car, sometimes longer depending on the vehicle that you're working on. Do not depend on the airbag fuse being a particular number. The numbers vary from vehicle to vehicle. In this case, we are dealing with fuse number 18, which is labeled the Supplemental Inflatable Restraint Fuse. Often you will see the fuse labeled SIR or simply as the airbag fuse. Next, we need to lower the hush panel below the dashboard and locate the airbag wire. This can be done before the waiting period has passed, but do not disconnect the wire until after the fuse has been removed. The airbag wire will be color-coded a bright yellow and has a CPA connector. The CPA connector contains a safety pin, which is always a contrasting color from the connector itself. This is a lock to prevent the connector from becoming disconnected. After the pin has been removed, pry the connector apart in the normal fashion, and we're ready to remove the airbag module. Because of the RPS unit, in order to prevent an accidental deployment of the airbag, it is extremely important that you follow each step in the correct order. Let's review the steps that you must take before removing the airbag module. First, disconnect the battery. If the car has a secondary power source, such as a cellular telephone or a burglar alarm with a built-in backup battery, you must also disconnect those. Then, wait the designated time period depending on the car that you're working on. Remove the SIR fuse or fuses. Then, locate and disconnect the airbag wire at the CPA connector below the dashboard. Then, and only then, are you ready to remove the airbag module. Avoid having your body directly in front of the airbag module as you remove it. There are 4 number 30 Torx screws securing the airbag module to the wheel. The screws will remain in the steering wheel. Slide the airbag module off and then disconnect the horn wire. This is a standard bayonet fitting, just like on a standard General Motors steering column. You can now pull the airbag module further away from the steering wheel and disconnect the second CPA connector, which attaches the airbag module to the airbag wire. Once the pin has been removed, gently pry the two portions of the CPA connector apart to release the airbag module. CPA stands for Contact Position Assurance. To help prevent static discharge damage, each CPA connector contains a shorting bar which shorts out the system as soon as the connector is separated. However, it is still a good idea to make sure that you're grounded whenever you're working on one of these. Once the airbag module is safely out of the way, preferably locked in your service truck or placed in the trunk of the car, you can remove the steering wheel. This is done in the normal fashion. An important thing to note is that these steering columns use a self-locking nut. There is no longer a clip which needs to be removed before the nut can be removed. Another interesting thing about this column is that the steering wheel only fits onto the steering shaft in one position. It is no longer necessary to check the alignment marks between the steering wheel and the steering shaft. Another very important thing to remember about these new GM steering wheels is that the holes for the puller bolts are drilled all the way through the wheel. If you tighten your puller bolts down with a wrench, they will go through the steering wheel and into the top of the coil assembly, which is located directly beneath the steering wheel. This would be a very costly mistake. For that reason, only put your puller bolts in finger tight, usually about 5 complete turns. Tighten the wheel puller and you're ready to pull the steering wheel. Once the wheel is loose, carefully pull it over the end of the shaft and thread the airbag wire through the hole in the steering wheel. When the steering wheel is out of the way, we can easily see the coil assembly. The coil assembly consists of a plastic housing which contains a central rotating hub and a mylar ribbon which carries current to the airbag module. This same assembly is known as a clock spring on a Ford or Chrysler vehicle. It is not necessary to lock the coil assembly into place before pulling the wheel because the tower from the turn signal canceling cam holds the central hub in place until the coil is removed from the steering shaft. However, you need to place a few pieces of tape between the central hub of the coil assembly and the outer portion of the coil before removing the coil from the steering shaft. There are two types of coils. Some are self-locking and some do not lock at all. It is impossible to tell the difference between the two from the top, so always put the tape on just in case. The next step is to remove the true arc ring which holds the coil assembly in place. After the ring has been removed from the steering shaft, the coil assembly will lift up and over the end of the steering shaft. It may be necessary to free up the airbag wire at the base of the steering column in order to get enough slack in the wire for the coil assembly to clear the shaft. This particular coil assembly turned out to be one of the self-locking type. This spring-loaded lever is released when the coil is removed from the column. The end of the lever arm snaps into place, preventing the coil from turning once the assembly has been removed from the steering column. Located directly below the coil assembly is a wave washer which maintains pressure on the coil assembly. Slide it over the end of the steering shaft to remove. Because of the added thickness of the coil assembly, the legs on many compression tools are not long enough to compress the lock plate. You may find it necessary to place a shim, such as these two large nuts, underneath the legs of your compression tool. Whatever you use, make sure that it is large enough that if it slips, it will not fall inside the steering column. Compress the spring and then release the snap ring around the steering column in the normal fashion. When the snap ring is free of its slot, it will slide up the steering shaft. It will then lock into the second slot that was occupied by the true arc ring which held the coil assembly in place. It's a fairly simple matter to free it up from the second slot. Then remove the compression tool and we're ready to remove the lock plate. The lock plate is also smaller in diameter than the old lock plates. You may find it necessary to bend the legs on your compression tool to make it fit. Remove the lock plate and then we're ready to remove the turn signal canceling cam, which simply slides over the end of the steering shaft. Once the canceling cam is out of the way, we can remove the spring which is below the canceling cam. From here on out, the disassembly is very much like the old columns. The turn signal arm is connected to the turn signal switch with a single screw and a sheet metal link. The turn signal switch is held into the column by 3 screws. Once those screws are removed, we can slide the switch up and over the end of the steering shaft. It may be necessary to free up the wires at the base of the column to get enough slack to clear the shaft. With the turn signal switch out of the way, hook the spring on the buzzer switch with a paper clip and pull it free of the column. The lock cylinder retaining screw requires a number 20 torque screwdriver to remove it. Once the retaining screw is out of the column, the cylinder is free to slide out of the column. There is enough slack in the V.A.T.S wires to allow you to pull the ignition lock out of the column and read the code number off the side of the lock. Once you have done what you needed to do with the ignition lock, slide it back into the column and you're ready to replace the retainer. With the retainer and the buzzer switch back in place, slide the turn signal switch back over the end of the steering shaft. Replace the turn signal switch, making certain that you don't pinch any of the wires underneath the turn signal switch. Replace the link to the turn signal arm and tighten the screw. Check the operation to make sure it works properly. And we're ready to replace the lock plate assembly. Slide the spring over the steering shaft, then bring in the turn signal canceling cam, placing the tower in approximately the same position it was in when you took it off. Now bring in the lock plate, slide it over the shaft. The splines will only align in one position. Align the canceling cam with the plate and replace the snap ring around the steering shaft. Work the snap ring past the slot in the steering shaft until it rests firmly against the base of the lock plate. Then we're ready to bring in our compression tool. Tighten the compression tool until the second slot in the steering shaft is visible above the lock plate. Then slide the snap ring down the steering shaft until it locks into place. Then we're ready to remove the compression tool. Then be sure to replace the wave washer. Slide the coil assembly into its approximate position and then pull downwards on the airbag wire to remove any of the slack inside the steering column before you attach the coil assembly to the shaft. Replace the snap ring over the steering shaft, press down on the coil assembly, and make certain that the snap ring seats properly into its slot all the way around. Once the coil assembly is seated, remove the pieces of tape and we're ready to replace the steering wheel itself. Notice this wire guide molded into the steering wheel itself. It is extremely important that the airbag wire be placed inside this guide. If it is not properly placed in the guide, it is possible to pinch the airbag wire around the mounting bolt for the airbag module itself. Slide the two portions of the CPA connector back together, then make certain that the pin seats completely in its slot in the CPA connector. Reconnect the horn wire into the tower on the turn signal canceling cam and then gently place the airbag module back in position. Double check and make sure that the airbag wire is properly in its guide. This is very important and very easy to miss. Once the wire is back in its guide, slide the airbag module back into place and we're ready to tighten. Once again, while working from outside the car, tighten all 4 of the airbag bolts evenly. Then go around and tighten them securely. There is no torque specification for these bolts, but be careful that you do not over-tighten them. At the base of the steering column, we're now ready to reconnect the airbag wire. Snap the two portions of the CPA connector back together, and then bring in the safety pin. Slide it back into the connector until it snaps home. Replace the airbag fuse or fuses, and we're ready to reconnect the battery. Just as with the older airbag columns, reconnect the battery with the ignition in the on position. This way, if there is an accidental deployment of the airbag, no one will be in the car. After the battery has been reconnected, re-enter the car through the passenger side. Turn the ignition key to the off position and pause for a few moments. Then turn the ignition back to the on position and observe the airbag warning light. It should flash the same number of times as it did before you disassembled the column if you had the key to work with in the beginning. That completes the standard airbag column. Now let's take a look at the anti-theft airbag column, which has replaced the square column in the W-body cars and the Beretta and Corsica. We need to follow the same precautions that we followed on the earlier steering column. These precautions are the same on any General Motors column that may have an RPS unit. First, disconnect the battery and any auxiliary power supplies. Then, wait at least 10 minutes depending on the vehicle. Remove the airbag fuse or fuses. Finally, lower the hush panel and disconnect the airbag wire at the CPA connector at the base of the steering column. After all of our safety precautions have been followed, we're ready to remove the airbag module itself. Once again, it is secured to the steering wheel by 4 number 30 Torx bolts. But these bolts are not captive in the steering wheel. They will come completely out. Once again, work from outside the car to prevent having your body in front of the airbag module. Once all of the bolts have been removed, gently lift the airbag module free of the steering wheel. Notice that the horn buttons are no longer attached to the airbag module itself. They are now a part of the steering wheel. Pay close attention to the routing of the airbag wire. Notice this plastic clip which holds the wire against the base of the airbag module. This is very important to prevent the wire from becoming pinched when you replace the airbag on the steering wheel. Carefully remove the wire from behind the plastic clip, and we're ready to remove the CPA connector. This connector, just like all of the other airbag connectors, has a shorting bar incorporated into it. But still, you should make sure that you're grounded before disconnecting it. Gently pry the safety pin free of the CPA connector. Make sure that you don't lose the pin. Then pull upwards on the upper portion of the CPA connector and carefully pry the two portions of the connector apart. Once the connector is free, place the airbag in a safe place, such as the trunk of the car or in your service truck, face up. We're now ready to disconnect the horn. Often you will find tape like this above the horn wires. This is to hold the wires in place while the airbag module is being placed onto the steering wheel. Carefully remove the tape and save it so that you can put it back when you replace the wheel. The horn connection is a standard bayonet fitting just like on the other column. With the horn wires safely out of the way, we can remove the nut that secures the steering wheel onto the steering shaft. We can then pull the wheel with the puller, following the same precautions with the puller bolts that we followed on the earlier column. Once the steering wheel is free of the shaft, carefully thread the airbag wire through the opening in the steering wheel. The coil assembly is identical to the one we had on the earlier column, and the procedures for locking it down and removing it are also the same. Just as with the earlier coil assembly, this one was self-locking. But there is no way to determine that from the top, so we tape the central portion of the coil assembly before removing it. Occasionally, you may come across a coil assembly with a broken locking device. The factory recommended procedure for that situation is not to replace the coil assembly. Find all of the broken parts of the lock assembly and remove them. Then continue to use the coil assembly without the locking device. Once again, there is a wave washer located beneath the coil assembly. Remove this, and the removal of the lock plate is the same as on the earlier column. The turn signal switch is somewhat different than the one on the earlier column. The turn signal arm is secured to the switch by a Torx screw. The link between the arm and the switch cannot be removed until the switch has been removed. You need to slide the link as far inside the steering column housing as possible in order to slide the switch past the link. Once the screw has been removed from the link, slide the link all the way up and inside the column by pulling on the turn signal arm. The hazard warning switch is located on the upper portion of the steering column. This is a lever which moves from left to right to activate the hazard warning lights. To remove the hazard warning control knob, pry gently on the forward edge of the knob. This will reveal an opening with a number 1 Phillips screw inside. You can use an offset screwdriver or tilt the steering column all the way down to remove the screw. Once the screw has been removed, the knob will lift off of the column and the turn signal switch can then be removed. Once the 3 screws which hold the turn signal switch in place have been removed, gently pull the switch past the turn signal arm link and over the end of the steering shaft. Once again, it may be necessary to free the wires at the base of the steering column to do this. The buzzer switch is the same style as we had on the older square steering columns. Pull upwards on the buzzer switch to remove it from its socket in the steering column. This cannot be done with the key in the lock. You must remove the key from the lock before removing the buzzer, or the buzzer switch will be damaged. Once the buzzer switch is out of the way, we can use a number 20 Torx screwdriver to remove the retaining screw that holds the ignition lock in place. Be careful with this screw, it can be very tight. It may be necessary to strike the head of your screwdriver with a hammer before removing the screw. Once the screw is out, we can pull the ignition lock out of its housing. Another new feature of this steering column is this support, which actually extends inside the ignition lock when the lock is in place in the column. This helps to support the sector gear at the back of the ignition lock. Slide the lock back into place and lift the rack gear in order for it to engage. When the key is inserted, notice this plastic lug which activates the buzzer switch. This is the reason the buzzer switch cannot be removed until the key has been removed. This traps the switch in place. Once the switch is back in the column, replace and tighten the retaining screw to hold the lock in place. The buzzer switch then slides into its socket in the steering column. It will slide in very easily when it is properly aligned. Do not force this switch, it is very fragile. Once the buzzer switch is in place, bring the turn signal switch up and over the end of the steering shaft. Once again, you will probably have to pull the wires at the base of the steering column in order to make the turn signal switch seat into the column. Replace the 3 screws that hold the turn signal switch in place and then reattach the turn signal arm. The screw that secures the turn signal arm is a self-locking screw. It will be tight all the way in. Check the operation of the switch and we're ready to replace the hazard warning knob. Bring the hazard warning knob back into place. Seat the screw into the switch body itself. Tighten the screw in the center, and once the screw has been tightened, flip the lid down into place. Once the lock plate assembly has been secured into the steering column, replace the wave washer and then lift the coil assembly over the end of the steering shaft. You will probably have to pull the wire from the base of the steering column once again in order to seat the coil over the end of the steering shaft. Make sure that the tower assembly of the turn signal canceling cam fits through its hole in the coil assembly. Once the coil is seated and the 2 outer lugs align with the slots in the steering column housing, we're ready to replace the snap ring. After the snap ring is in place, we can remove the strips of tape which were securing the central portion of the coil assembly. Once this has been done, we can replace the steering wheel. Once again, bring the steering wheel back into place. Carefully slide the airbag wire through the opening in the wheel and position the wheel on the steering shaft. Like the earlier wheel, this one will only go on in one position. When the wheel is in place, make sure that the airbag wire has not been pinched, and then bring in the nut and tighten the wheel. Reconnect the horn to the top of the turn signal canceling cam. Once the bayonet fitting is secure, then take the individual horn wires and tuck them into their slots, which are molded into the plastic of the steering wheel. This is to prevent the wires from becoming pinched underneath the airbag module. After the wires are in their place, bring the tape back in and secure the wires back the way they were when you started. Bring the airbag module back into place and reconnect the CPA connector. Slide the fittings together until they snap, and then bring in the safety pin and slide it back into its position. Once again, I cannot overstress how important it is to wrap the airbag wire back around the post the way it was when you started. Wrap the wire around the post, hook it over its clip, and then turn the airbag around into its proper position and carefully seat it back onto the steering wheel. Once again, there is no torque specification on the screws which hold the airbag to the steering wheel itself, but be careful about over-tightening them. They are number 30 torque screws. All that remains to be done now is to reconnect the CPA connector at the base of the steering column, being sure to replace the pin in the connector, replace the airbag fuses in the fuse box, reconnect the battery, and test the unit as we did before. That completes the anti-theft column. Now let's take a look at the last GM steering column, the non-tilt airbag column. Remember, this column is only found in certain Beretta and Corsica models. Once again, the initial procedure for working on any of these three new GM steering columns is to disconnect the battery and any auxiliary power sources, wait at least 10 minutes depending on the vehicle that you're working on, remove the airbag fuse or fuses, and then disconnect the airbag wire. These steps must be followed in order for your own safety. The removal of the airbag module is identical to that shown on the earlier column, with the exception that this airbag module does not have the plastic clip to hold the wire. The wire simply wraps around the stud which supports the airbag module itself. The CPA connector is identical. The horn connection, horn wiring, and the steering wheel are all identical to the last column that we've just seen. Remember, do not thread your puller bolts in with a wrench. Finger tight only. No more than 5 complete revolutions. You can do serious damage to the coil assembly if you penetrate the steering wheel and puncture the top of the coil assembly. The coil assembly and its removal are identical to the columns we've already seen. Be sure to tape the center portion of the coil assembly because you cannot tell the difference between the locking and non-locking coil assemblies from the top. Slide the coil assembly over the end of the steering shaft, and in this case the wave washer followed the coil assembly part way out. Be sure that you don't lose the wave washer. The most important difference between this steering column and the ones we've already seen is this part right here. This is a plastic shim which takes up the space between the lock plate and the coil lock assembly. The sole purpose of this part is to compress the lock spring on the base of the coil assembly. This is a plastic part and it lifts off of the tower on the turn signal canceling cam. If you leave this part out, the coil assembly will break the first time the wheel is turned. With the lock plate assembly removed, we can see that the turn signal switch and the hazard warning switch are virtually identical to the old style steering columns. These are not actually Phillips head screws, they are posi drive screws. A Phillips head screwdriver will work just fine for these, but a posi drive driver works better. The screws can easily be identified as posi drive screws by the 4 hash marks around the outside edge of the screw. Once the link is out of the way, we can remove the screws that hold the turn signal in place and slide it over the end of the steering shaft. On this particular column, we had great difficulty getting the turn signal switch over the end of the shaft because of very little slack in the wiring. Use a paper clip under the spring in the buzzer switch to remove the switch. The switch is just a little longer than the ones we're used to seeing. The surprise is the lock retaining screw, which uses a 5/16 hex head. After the bolt has been removed, we can see that it is basically a standard retaining screw except for the head. Once the retaining screw has been removed, all we need to do is pull the lock free of the lock housing. The ignition lock itself is a standard ignition lock. No surprises here. Once again, the code is clearly stamped on the side of the lock and a key can easily be made. Once the key has been made, check its operation and then be sure to remove the key before you replace the lock in the steering column. Then replace the retaining bolt, tighten it securely, and then bring back in the buzzer switch and slide it into its socket in the steering column. After you have replaced the turn signal switch, turn signal canceling cam, and the lock plate assembly, bring the spacer back into place, slip it gently over the tower on the turn signal canceling cam, and align the post at the end of the spacer into the slot in the lock plate. After replacing the wave washer, slide the coil over the end of the steering shaft just as you did on the earlier columns. Pull the wire from below the steering column to bring the coil assembly down over the steering shaft and the tower on the turn signal canceling cam. Once it is in place, we can remove the tape and replace the snap ring. The rest of the reassembly is virtually identical to the last column that we saw. But remember, after you reconnect the airbag wire, make certain that you wrap the wire around the post at the base of the airbag module. This is extremely important. If you pinch the wire and short it out, you could accidentally deploy the airbag. Don't forget the safety pin in the CPA connector. And we're ready to replace the airbag module on the wheel. Once the module is back on, the rest of the reassembly is just like the other columns, including the testing procedures. That completes the new GM steering columns, but before we go on to the Chrysler, let's take a look at the 48-pin V.A.T.S connector, which is used on many of the new GM vehicles. Once again, we'll be dealing with a 1991 Cadillac sedan DeVille, which is equipped with the 48-pin connector. We'll demonstrate two different methods of dealing with this connector, the Kent-Moore 48-pin adapter and the Tech-Train 4002 V.A.T.S bypass adapter. On this car, the first step in using the Kent-Moore adapter is to remove the fuse box. The 1990 models, the fuse box was bolted in place, but on the 91s it snaps into place for easy removal. If you're careful, you can actually swing the fuse box completely outside the car and hang it on the edge of the door frame. Next, bring in a 9/32 socket wrench and loosen the bolt in the center of the 48-pin connector. I realize it is very hard to see in this picture where the 48-pin connector is, but this is a very cramped place to work. The bolt in the 48-pin connector is captive. It will not come all the way out. But once you feel that it is completely loosened, you can then reach in and pull the outer portion of the 48-pin connector free of its socket. Pull the wiring harness all the way down until you can bring the Kent-Moore adapter into place. There are two locating lugs on the right-hand side of the plug which align with two slots in the socket. Carefully seat the adapter into the socket and make sure that it seats completely. Once the smaller end of the adapter is completely seated into the socket, bring the wiring harness back into place and plug it into the open end of the adapter. While you're doing this, be very careful of that red tube which is located directly below my hand. That is a vacuum tube and it is very easily disconnected. If you disconnect this tube, the parking brake will not release. Here are the two connectors from the 48-pin adapter. Only the large connector needs to be attached to the interrogator in order to interrogate the vehicle. The other plug is for checking the wiring in the steering column. but it doesn't hurt to connect both wires. We can now interrogate the vehicle in exactly the same fashion as we would any other V.A.T.S equipped vehicle. The V.A.T.S bypass adapter from TechTrain does not require the disassembly of any portion of the wiring harness. All you have to do is slide the mechanical key between the two plates in the bypass adapter, making sure that it seats all the way, and then connect the interrogator to the other end of the adapter. Once again, the smaller of the two plugs from the interrogator is the only plug that is used during the interrogation process. Once the adapter is attached to the interrogator, insert the key into the ignition lock. Set the interrogator to the resistance value that you wish to try, and then attempt to start the car by turning the ignition key with the bypass adapter attached. If the car starts, you've chosen the correct resistor. If not, turn the ignition off and reset the interrogator to a new value, wait 4 minutes, and try again. For more information on the V.A.T.S system and the interrogation process, consult TechTrain's video number 558, V.A.T.S Made Simple. Now let's go on to the CHRYSLER ACCUSTAR steering column. For the most part, this steering column has replaced the Saginaw-style tilt column which was shown in our first airbag video. This column is very easily identified by the square housing and the lighted ring around the ignition lock. The horn buttons are located to either side of the airbag module, and if the vehicle is equipped with cruise control, the controls are mounted directly below the airbag module in this black area. The steering wheel does not have to be removed in order to service the ignition lock on this column. The outer housing of the column must be removed and is held in place by 3 number 20 Torx screws. The 2 on the outside are self-tapping screws, and the one in the center is a self-locking machine screw. Just as with any other steering column, you need to disconnect the battery before you begin the disassembly. Also, wait 10 to 15 minutes for the RPS unit on the airbag module to drain. After the 3 Torx screws have been removed, we can take the housing off the column. In order to remove the upper portion of the steering column housing, you must first remove the tilt lever. This lever unscrews from a socket inside the housing. It shouldn't be more than finger tight. The 2 portions of the steering column housing interlock at the rear. To separate them, squeeze the lower portion until the 2 sections snap apart. Repeat the same procedure on both sides and lower the lower section and lift the upper section away from the column. With the housing removed, we can easily see the retainer that holds the lock into the ignition lock module. This retainer is a roll pin, but it is not pulled out, it is pushed in to release. The lock used in this steering column is known as the push-to-lock lock. As you can see, the entire lock pushes in and out in its housing. The retainer is mounted in a slot and moves back and forth as the lock is depressed. The lock must be pushed in order to turn the key to the off position. This lock cannot be removed unless it can be turned to the on position. The retainer can be depressed in any position except the start position. Depress the retainer, insert the key into the lock, turn it to the on position, and the lock will pop out a notch. Turn it back to the off position and remove the key, and the lock will slide out of the housing. With the lock removed from the steering column, let's take a look at the operation. The retainer can be pressed down in any position except the start and accessory positions, with or without the key. Inserting the key, turning the lock either to the accessory position or the start position will bring the retainer back up to the lock position. Notice that when the key is inserted into the lock, the key buzzer pops upwards. This is what holds the lock into the steering column after it has been turned to the on position. The lug on the cam holds the lock in place until it is turned to the start position. Inside the ignition switch assembly, we can see the opening that allows the ignition lock to pop out when it is turned to the start position. In order to reinstall the lock back into the switch, it must again be turned to the start position in order for the lugs to align with the opening. To remove the lock, first press the retainer and then slide it into its housing. Insert the key, turn to the on position, and press in. Then turn the lock to the start position, press the retainer, remove the key, and it's back in place. The shrouding around the steering column can now be replaced. If the key is not available to the lock, you can still remove it in a variety of ways. You can make a key by impression, you can pick the lock, or you can make a key by the progression. If you would like more information on the new CHRYSLER double-bitted locks, refer to Tech Tape number 564, CHRYSLER double-bitted locks. Because the two outer screws are self-tapping screws, it's often easier to put those two screws in first, then tilt the steering column to the up position and visually align the machine screw, which holds the entire housing against the steering column itself. Remember, all three of these screws are number 20 Torx screws. Once again, the battery is reconnected with the switch in the on position. Enter through the passenger side and turn the switch off. Remember that you have to press in to turn to the off position. Pause a moment, then turn the switch back on and observe the airbag warning light. If it operates properly, the job is now complete. That completes Airbag Steering Columns Volume 2. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video as much as I've enjoyed making it. If you have any questions, suggestions, or comments, please write to us at this address: Tech Train Productions, Post Box 15401, Pensacola, Florida 32514. Our toll-free order line is 800-356-0136, or you can fax us at area code 904-476-7410. Thank you for choosing Tech Train.